Hey guys, how's it going? I'm back here with another video, and today I will go over every single thing you need to know in JavaScript for you to be prepared to start learning React. I know for a fact a lot of people try to search for this because I remember me myself when I started learning React searching for the same thing and never getting a concrete answer. And the reason for this is because a lot of people who want to learn React is either people who have zero to no experience in programming or programmers who don't have a lot of experience in web development. And they know that React is a very requested, a very in-demand technology, and they want to get there as fast as possible. However, they know that in most places they recommend you to learn JavaScript, like get as good as you can with JavaScript before you start learning React. However, that's not exactly true because not everything in JavaScript is necessary for you to start learning React. Actually, there is a very specific set of skills and concepts that you need to learn in JavaScript before you go into React. So for that reason, in this video, I will go over all of them and try to explain each one of them to the best of my abilities. If you could leave a like before we get into the video, I would massively appreciate it because it will help push my videos to more people. And yeah, let's get into the video. So for this video, I'm gonna skip the super basic stuff like defining variables and like basic introduction to functions and whatever, because honestly, I feel like that's implied that you need to know the basics of programming and the basics of a language syntax. Every React tutorial out there, they probably won't be teaching you like what is const, what is let, that kind of stuff. So what I'm gonna be going over is the more not well-known stuff in JavaScript, or more intermediate, slightly beginner stuff that will be very useful in React. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is just working with functions in general. Well, what I mean by that? Well, the first thing is when you're working with React, you'll find yourself working a lot with arrow functions. And for those who don't know, arrow functions is just a different way to define your functions. So in normal JavaScript, you would, for example, define a function like this, saying function, then the name of the function. Let's call this function do something. And you would define it with a parentheses and your curly braces. Then you would write all of the logic inside of here for whatever you want to do when this function is executed. Now, with the introduction of newer versions of JavaScript, we've seen the introduction of a different way to define this, which is by using arrow functions. And this syntax is actually seen in many different languages, which is, it's why, in my opinion, I kind of like this. And to define the function, you can either use the const, the let, or the var keywords, but I would always recommend using the const for this because it's more standard. And what you would do is you would say const, then the name of the function, like do something. Then you would put an equal sign, the parentheses, an arrow, and the curly braces. Now, you may think that this is more, like you're writing more stuff, but in my opinion, it compensates because it makes it a lot better when you're working with callback functions, which is something that you work a lot with in JavaScript. So I do recommend using the arrow function, and also when you're using arrow functions, although they do the exact same, you can actually export it a little bit differently. So if you're planning on exporting this function to have access to it in another file, there's two different ways of doing this. If you're using this function definition, you have to say export default, like this, and then you'll be able to export this function. But if you're using this one, you don't say default, you say just export const. And I use this kind of notation a lot more than this kind of notation. Now, why is this important for React? Well, because in React, you define components, and components are just functions like this one. I'll just say my component, which takes in props, which are arguments, and return HTML. Like I can return a div or something like that. Now, this is React. This is something specific to React. But you can see how learning the different methodologies of defining function can be useful for this kind of situation. So this is why it would be important. But another thing that I feel like for functions would be really important for you to know is anonymous functions. So for example, in React, you might see a button like this. I know right now it's just a button in the middle of the file. It doesn't even make sense. But imagine you have a button like this, which has the property onClick. Well, when you have an onClick, usually in normal JavaScript, you pass the name of a function inside of here, right? But in React, you can do either that, or you can just define the function inline with an anonymous function, something similar to this. So you could actually write a function like this, where it would be executed when you click on the button, and it would work perfectly. And this is actually recommended in some scenarios. So knowing how to create a function that doesn't have a name, which is what an anonymous function is really important because it allows you to execute commands without having to declare a function. So keep in mind that this is very useful and you'll use it like a lot in React. So the next thing I want to talk about is working with conditionals using the ternary operators. And this is specifically very useful in React because of the nature of React. When you code in React, you'll soon realize that you're trying to minimize the amount of lines of code you're writing, especially when you're writing code directly into the UI portion of your code. So React actually allows you to kind of write JavaScript inside of your HTML, but it's not actually called HTML. It's a modified version of HTML called JSX, which allows you to directly write JavaScript, right? It's one of the best parts of React because it allows you to write conditionals and write your logic and make that represent your UI. So when you're doing something like that, you need to decrease the amount of lines of code you're writing inside of your UI so that it doesn't become super messy. So that's where ternary operators come in, because writing an if statement is pretty big, right? To write something like if true, then do this, it takes in already 3 lines of code, and don't even mention doing an if-else statement, which actually put the wrong kind of brackets, but it takes in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 lines of code, right? And if you're writing code in React, you don't really need this. You don't want this. So what I like to do is, for example, like this. Imagine that we have a Boolean, right? Let age equal to 10. Let's just say age is equal to 10. You have not a Boolean, a number, right? And I have another variable, which is like a name of someone. Let's say name, right? And for some reason, this person's name is called Pedro, right? Very nice coincidence. Well, I want to say something different. I want to say that if the age is 10, or greater, if the age is greater than 10, then this person's name is Pedro. But if it's not, for some reason, this person's name is Jack, right? But to do something like that, I would have to say if age is greater than 10, then let's say name is equal to Pedro, like this, Pedro, and else we would say name is equal to Jack, which is all fine and well, but the problem again, as I mentioned, is this is taking way too much space and there's easier ways of doing this. And this is where the 3 ternary operators come into place. They're basically shorthand notations for doing if statements or if else statements. So if I have if I didn't even have an if else here, if it was just, okay, let the name be equal to Pedro if age is greater than 10. Then, first of all, let me make this greater than 10. Let me make this 16, which is not my age, by the way. But if I want to do something like this, I can just say, okay, let name equal to age. And if age is greater than 10, then set it equal to Pedro. I know this looks weird, but all you're saying here is if this condition is true, then do this. And since this is after the equal sign, we're just saying let name be equal to Pedro if this condition is true. And this will work. Now, there's the other ternary operator, which is this one over here, which is the double or, which is kind of the opposite. It would work the other way. So if it's not equal to 10, it basically wouldn't do this because this right now is satisfying the condition. And finally, there's the if-else operator, which is basically what we wanted in the beginning. So if we want to set it equal to Pedro if age is greater than 10, then we say if age is greater than 10, then let's set name equal to Pedro. Else, accidentally deleted everything. Else, we put a colon. Let's name this Jack. So this is the if-else operators. This basically says if this is true, then this, else this. And this will work the same way as that huge if-else statement that I presented to you guys earlier. So why is this useful? Where in React, you find yourself creating returning HTML, right? So if I have a component, like I mentioned, you would have something like this, where it's a function which returns some sort of HTML, like a div, right? But imagine that you have two divs. You have a div that says Pedro, so you have some sort of piece of UI which displays the name Pedro, and some sort of piece of UI which displays Jack, right? And you want to conditionally render these two pieces of UI depending on this variable age. Well, you could just say return if age is greater than 10, then return this, else return this, and this would work perfectly. This is something we're doing a lot in React. We add these conditions so that our UI will change based on the state of our application. So this is why ternary operators are extremely important and will be very useful for your React development journey. The next thing I want to talk about is I really want to go over really quickly all of the important stuff related to objects, because objects are very useful. It's one of the most useful data structures a language can have. Objects, by the way, are also known as dictionaries in Python, or hash tables, hash maps. It has different names, but in JavaScript it's called objects, and I feel like that's the best name in my opinion. It's the most, the one that makes more sense. And objects are very important in React. And there are specific things that people don't learn when they're learning JavaScript, or usually forget, which I want to remind you guys because they will be used a lot in JavaScript, in React. And the first thing is being able to destructure objects, right? So imagine we have this object over here, which is a person, right? And I'll define the object really easily by saying it has three properties. One which is name, which is Pedro. The other one which is age, which is my actual age, which is 20. And the last one is, well, let's say is married, which is a Boolean, which is true or false. And in my case, it's false. So, okay, we have this object called person, which is really nice. And imagine if we want to create variables that represent specific values inside of this object. So usually, if you want to do something like that, you can say const name is equal to person.name, right? Then we say const age is equal to person.age. And then we say const is married is equal to person.isMarried. This works fine. We now have three different variables and it's all fine. But again, we run into the problem where this is taking too much space. We can actually do this in a single line by using the destructuring property of objects, which it works like this. You say const, then you open and close curly braces, set this equal to the object name, which is person, and you can destruct anything, any key value pair from this object directly over here as a variable. Like I can grab the name, the age, and the is married directly from here. And now I have three different variables which represent their corresponding properties inside of person. Now, this is really nice. You use this a lot, especially when you're working with prompts, which I won't go over because this is not a React tutorial. This is a JavaScript tutorial for people who want to learn React or are learning React, but it is very useful for that, and you'll find yourself using this a lot. And another thing that this corresponds to that is important to learn is basically whenever you have an object like this, where it's called person, and you already have a variable, for example, name, which is equal to Pedro, and you basically want to set this object to have the value name equal to this variable you have over here at the top, right? So this is very common. I have this variable called name, and now I'm creating an object called person, which its name key has the same value as the name variable. Well, you could do something like this and set name equal to name, but there's the shorthand notation, which is really nice, and I would definitely recommend you doing this, which is when the key of this key value pair has the same name as the variable you're setting it equal to, you don't have to repeat the variable name. You can just do this, and it would be exactly the same. So if I also had another variable called age, and I just want to set it equal to age over here, I don't do this, I just do this, and it is exactly the same. You can do both ways, but this is recommended by far. Now, the last thing I want to show you guys is the fact that if I want to, for example, create a new variable, a new object called person2, for example, and I want to basically set it equal to the same thing. Imagine person2 is exactly the same person as person1, but the name is not Pedro. So the name is different, right? Let me actually delete these variables over here, and let's make them almost exactly the same. I'll just say Pedro over here for the person1, and the age for the person1 is 20. Now person2 is exactly the same, but the name is different. The name is Jack. Well, how would I copy this object but only change one single property of it? Well, you can do it by doing this thing. You use the spread operator, which is useful not only for objects, but for a lot of stuff in JavaScript. And this basically says, okay, I want to keep everything inside of the person object. So I'm saying I want to keep everything from this inside of this object, but whatever I put over here, which I can say name, and change it equal to something else like Jack. And now person2 will be an object that is exactly the same as person1, but this property is different. So it will be just the same thing, but the name is Jack. This is very useful, believe me, this is extremely useful. You'll see this when you're working with arrays, because it works the same way with arrays. Like if I create an array over here called names, and I set it equal to Pedro, then to Jack, and then to Jessica, right? Then I want to create an array called names2, which is exactly the same, but I want to add a new name to it. Well, I can just say, okay, names2 is equal to names, but also add the person called Joel. I don't know why I'm thinking of just people with J, but you get what I mean, right? This is really important because this is how you're going to manipulate and add elements to arrays that are inside of states. So if you don't know that, make sure you're able to at least comprehend what we're doing over here. This is the same thing as just saying that names2 is equal to names plus this. So keep that in mind because it's really important. The next concept, which I definitely think is extremely important for you to know, is being able to work with the three fundamental functions of JavaScript arrays. So they're not fundamental, I don't even know why I called it that way, but it's the three functions that we all know when we're learning JavaScript, which are useful for manipulating arrays in a very easy manner. Those three functions are the .map function, then there's the .filter function, and then there's the .reduce function. Now, I'm not going to talk about the .reduce because I don't find myself using this a lot in React. Like, not even near the amount that I find myself using the map and the filter. So I don't want to overcomplicate this. There's thousands of videos out there of the reduce function if you want to learn it. But since this is focused just on React, I do feel like these two functions over here definitely outshine the third one. So I'm going to go over both of them right now. So what exactly are the map and the filter function? Well, so imagine you have this array called names, right? And I want to, for some reason, console log every single name in this array. And I want to do something different. I wanna basically just add a number 1 to the end of each of the names. Now, ignore the usability of this example, but just imagine I want to alter each element individually. Well, how would I do that? I can do that very easily by just doing a for loop and then manually mutating each of the elements to have a 1 at the end, something like this. But that, as always, will take a lot of lines of code, right? It will take, like, I would have to say for let I equal 0. Then I could also use a for each loop, right? Which could be very useful, but in this case, I want to do something a little bit different. I'll say names.map, and the map function takes in an argument to it. The argument is basically some sort of variable that you define that represents each element in this array. So we're going to iterate through this array completely, and for each element that exists in this array, we're going to execute whatever is inside of this function that we created using the arrow function. So this is an anonymous function, which we talked in the beginning of the video, and we write code that will be executed for each of the elements in the array. So what we can do is we can actually access each element by grabbing them as the argument of this array. So if I say something like console log name, like this, and I run this, then basically it would just console log each of the names. It would console log Pedro 1, Jessica 1, Carol 1. I also forgot to remove the 1 from each of them because this is what we're going to be doing with this example. But basically, how would I do something like mutate them directly and add the 1 to the end? Well, if you return something inside of this function, then for each element in this names array, it will represent, the element will change depending on what you put over here. So if I actually wanted to change every element in this array to have the name Joe, then I could do something like this, and every element in the array would become Joe because we're not actually, we're just saying return Joe for each element. But if I want to basically use the current name in the array together with this, then I can say name plus 1. And it will now, every element will become the name, or the same element, plus the 1 at the end, which is the example we wanted to present, right? And this is useful because when you have lists in React, and you have, for example, you want to basically return an h1 tag, right? A header tag with each of the names, right? What you can do is you can say names.map, then grab the name, and then for each element in this array, you can return an h1 tag saying something like name, like this. And what this will do in React is it will basically generate a header for each element in the list. So this is how you would render or display in your website lists in React. Now, I don't expect you to know this because I'm trying to make this video beginner friendly for people who never learned React. But this is something that kind of show you guys that it's very similar to what we've been doing so far. And this is very common in React. So this is why learning the map function is very useful. Now, the filter function is a bit different. Imagine that I want to keep everyone in this list of names, and imagine this list of names have some more Pedros, right? It has Pedro, and it has another Pedro. How do I remove every single Pedro from this list? Well, I can do something like this. I can say names.filter, and this filter function is similar to the map function in the sense that it will loop through every element in this array, and you can grab each name by putting the value to the argument. But you put over here as a return, instead of whatever you want to replace the element in the array with, which is what the map function requires, you actually put a condition. And if the condition is true, then what we can do is we can just put over here that we only want to keep the people whose name is not equal to Pedro. So this over here would make names become an array without Pedro or this other two Pedros over here. So it would just keep as an array as Jessica and Carol. This is, again, super useful. You'll see yourself doing this a lot. I find this very useful whenever you're doing like searching or filtering through lists, which obviously it's the main point of this function. But again, keep in mind, this is just an introduction. So if you want to look further, I do have videos on this where I explain better. So if you want to check out, just go into my channel and look for the video. So the last concepts that I want to go over, I won't actually explain it to you guys. And the reason for that is because I've already made extensive videos on them, which I'm literally showing you guys right now. If you want to check them out, I go over all of the concepts that I'm listing right now. And those concepts are really important because they are fundamental for any kind of web development application. It doesn't have to be just React in general. It works with, it is important for every kind of application. And the reason for that is because it is working with APIs. And most websites nowadays have to communicate with an API in some sort of way. So the concepts that I'm listing over here are the following. First, you need to be able to work with promises and Async-Await. I do have a video on that, and I would definitely check it out, or if you want, you can check out other videos as well. But this topic specifically will be very useful because you will be requesting data, and you need to be able to handle the data that you receive in a way that will work correctly. Then you also need to know how to fetch data, and that's where the fetch API comes in. Now in React, there's multiple ways of fetching data from an API. You don't need to use the fetch API. However, I would definitely try to learn it first, because even using other libraries like Axios, which is a React library to do this, it's very similar. So understanding how to work with the fetch API is very important. So those are the 3 last topics that I wanted you guys to at least know. And that's basically it for everything that I feel like you need to know in JavaScript before going into React. Now, I know that I assumed that you guys knew the basic of JavaScript before this, and the reason for that is because, yes, you're not required to know all of the stuff that I listed in this video before attempting to learn React. But I do feel like if you put yourself in a position where you at least get a basic idea of what each of the concepts I listed is, then you'll have a much easier time. I'm gonna be honest, I didn't know all of these things that I listed. I actually went into learning React without having any knowledge of JavaScript. And it was tough, but it was completely doable. I know a lot of you guys like to think that you're not good enough, or that whichever YouTuber you're watching teaching must be a genius or whatever. It's not true whatsoever. I struggled a lot with React when I started learning, and now I see the issues and the mistakes that I committed. So I wanted to help you guys out and let you know that if you follow this kind of strategy, if you learn this kind of stuff, then you're going to put yourself in a position where you're going to be comfortable learning React, and you'll have a much easier time than what I did when I started learning. So with that in mind, I really hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you enjoyed it, please leave a like down below and comment what you want us next. Also give me feedback. I'm trying to make some videos which are kind of like tutorials, but are not just for React developers. Some stuff for more JavaScript developers as well. Try to branch out a little bit while also maintaining my React content. So let me know what you think. If you enjoyed it, support the channel. And yeah, that's basically it. Really hope you guys enjoyed it, and I see you guys next time.